There's at least three big things going on in America right now. Specific harms to particular populations like trans people, immigrants. There's a constitutional crisis and what someone has called open heart surgery on the foreign policy establishment. And all three of these are a big deal. I would like to do videos soon about the first category, like what's happening with trans people. It's important to talk about. At the moment, I'm going to talk mostly about the latter two things. I think that they're pretty important because they affect the entire balance of power in the US political system. So I'm going to talk about the constitutional crisis and the situation with USAID, which relates to the foreign policy establishment. If you follow different lawyers and law professors on Substack, you might know everything I'm about to say. But I feel like the Democrats aren't saying it very clearly, and a lot of my friends don't seem to grasp what I'm about to say about the constitutional crisis. So for what it's worth, I think we're in a constitutional crisis, and that the nature of it is essentially about two things. One is the nature of the so-called administrative state, and the second one is an obscure practice called impoundment, which relates to the spending authority of Congress and of the executive. So the first one we talked about in the last video with the Francis Fukuyama clip, and he was talking about how there's this kind of inherent tension between democracy, where you might want the bureaucracies of the government to reflect the popular will or be appointed directly by the new administration. But there's also something good about federal bureaucracies being nonpartisan, impartial, and both things are good. Like I always use the analogy of not the analogy, but the example of the DMV. I believe we all assume that we can go to the DMV and get the same service, the same mediocre service, whether we're regardless of your party registration. And it should also be regardless of your race or religion, things like that. And if we found out that wasn't true, that Republicans had shorter wait times or Democrats had short wait times, that would be a scandal. We would not expect that.
Modern public administration was built around the Weberian ideal of bureaucracy, that bureaucrats would be nonpartisan expert administrators in an impersonal state serving public interest. This concept today seems old-fashioned. It's been under pretty relentless attack, especially by conservatives, for many years. This really began in the 1930s at the beginning of the New Deal and the growth of the American administrative state. So what I want to do in this talk is to defend the idea of bureaucratic autonomy, that is, the necessity of delegating substantial authority to bureaucracies in a modern democracy. But we do need to think carefully about how democratic principles control bureaucratic agents and admit that there is actually some justice to conservative complaints about an out-of-control administrative state, because you can find definite examples of that.
The neutrality of the bureaucracy is actually really important. So that we talked about that in the last video. But there is this tension with democracy, and it's been, I think, like an open, not fully resolved question in American law for decades. And I think we're now seeing an administration that's really willing to kind of test the limits of that.
Do we believe in executive branch agencies which are subject to congressional control and under the supervision of the president? Or do we believe, in effect, that we ought to have independent agencies in which the presidential power to remove and to control are going to be sharply circumscribed? Whenever you put somebody into power, there is always the chance that they will morph from an agent of the public at large to those of the factional issues that represents them. And to some extent, this is compounded the moment you get away from the electoral system, because administrative agencies are almost by definition insulated from popular control.
We've talked about Schedule F. All of this is going to probably end up in front of the Supreme Court. There's already, I think today, or maybe it was filed yesterday, there's a case about USAID specifically, those workers contesting the ability of Trump to just put them on administrative leave. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that court case. But that's a big part of the tension that's going on, or the crisis that's going on, is what authority does the president actually have over federal bureaucracy?
So unitary executive theory is a theory of executive power that is founded in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution broadly says that the executive power is vested in the president. And from that, and the president has to take care to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. And from that, a lot of scholars have drawn the proposition that the president has significant authority to manage subordinates. I've already talked about how a lot of these orders seem to violate statutes or regulations or other things. There's a loophole here, right? Which is, if for some reason the entire civil service is unconstitutional, then it doesn't really matter.
And when you say civil service, you mean the limitations on the president's power to do things to the civil service.
Correct. Right. If this tenure system that we have built and the due process protections that are afforded to federal employees are unconstitutional, then a lot of this is moot, right? It doesn't matter if the president violates the Civil Service Reform Act all that much if huge portions of it are unconstitutional anyway. So this seems to be the play. They think there's a constitutional hook to all of this. And there's, it's unclear how far the Supreme Court will take this. And I'm not going to make a prediction as to like who's on what side here. I think they really want the constitutional hook, and they view this as the most opportune moment, given the composition of the Supreme Court, given the composition of the lower courts, to really press unitary executive theory and argue that a large swath of civil service laws that have existed are unconstitutional.
The second part, I think, is maybe less familiar to more people. I'd never even heard of this before. Impoundment. But essentially, for 200 years-ish, there was this kind of practice, this de facto practice, where the president would treat congressional appropriation like a ceiling, but not a floor. So Congress could say, here's some money to buy, to build 10 warships, and the president could build 8 and say, we only need 8, here's the change. It's not perfectly clear to me how common this was or what limitations, existed when this was practiced in the past. But it all came to a stop essentially in the 70s with Richard Nixon. He, by most accounts, abused the impoundment power. Like he would just kind of willy-nilly say, no, we're not building that, we're not doing this, we're not doing this. And Congress passed a law called the Impoundment Control Act. So essentially for 50 years-ish since the Impoundment Control Act, presidents have been expected to treat congressional appropriation as both a ceiling and a floor. So if Congress says, here's X million dollars to build 17, fighter planes, you build exactly those 17 fighter planes. There's not really discretion. So the new administration basically plans to challenge the constitutionality of the ICA.
Just as importantly, bringing back impoundment will give us a crucial tool with which to obliterate the deep state, drain the swamp, and starve the warmongers, these people that want wars all over the place, killing. They love killing. And the globalists out of our government. We're going to get the warmongers and the globalists out of our government. With impoundment, we can simply choke off the money.
I think they have a little bit of wiggle room, even under the ICA, to do certain kinds of spending freezes for, 45 days or 90 days. But it's clear from the writings of Russ Vought, who's the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, that their plan is to see how far they can push this, see how far they can just say, we're not spending this money because we don't think it's important, or we don't think this agency needs as much money to achieve its mission, whatever. So we should probably all anticipate that ending up in the courts very soon, or in the Supreme Court very soon. And it's really not clear what's going to happen. There's, in a certain sense, the Republicans have all of the cards. They have a president with a real kind of popular legitimacy. They have both houses of Congress. They have I don't know how you measure the partisanship of the Supreme Court exactly, but it's generally considered, that they have a sympathetic Supreme Court. So, to me, it seems possible that they get everything that they want and that major chunks of the federal government are defunded. Not everyone is that pessimistic. There's a law professor who is, I think, the chief Supreme Court correspondent for CNN. I think he's currently at Georgetown Law. His opinion is that he doesn't think this kind of strong case for impoundment is going to make it past the Supreme Court, that they'll be more skeptical of it. So that's interesting. So I think that's a lot of what's going on, is that they really believe they should have the authority to fire everyone and to not spend money. And there's going to be a lot of court fights about this, and some of them are already happening. I'll mention, I think I mentioned a site called Lawfare before, or showed screenshots from it. They have an interesting tracker that shows a lot of different court cases against the Trump executive orders. They also have a podcast, which is being updated fairly frequently now. And so you can get interesting kind of live commentary from people who know what they're talking about these different topics. They had one about impoundment about a week ago.
I think, the Supreme Court has itself become more partisan in some ways, but still is very attentive, I think is very attentive to the law, and also takes a longer view of certain issues and would appreciate, the long-term ramifications of recognizing the presidential constitutional impoundment power. Also, is very attentive to practice, or what it likes to call history and tradition. And I think if you approach the issue that way, then we're dealing with a half-century-old statute that, has been embraced by both Congress and the executive branch, taken as a real framework for how the branches relate. And so I think the court would be reluctant to throw that out the window. Maybe there are certain narrower challenges that could succeed, but that would be my overall prediction, or at least my hope, because I think that's the right answer and the right way to think about this problem.
And I think there is kind of a third issue. I don't know if it's quite constitutional, but like part of what people are upset about isn't just those issues. It's what feels like the reckless nature of the access by DOJ. And I don't know the exact details. Like, is it read only? Is it read write access? Are they getting the appropriate security clearances, conflicts of interest, stuff like that? I don't really know the fine details there, but I think that's part of the crisis that people are feeling, is the kind of the speed and the what looks like the recklessness of how it's being done. Maybe what's in the news most, I think, about the Trump administration lately is USAID. I think it's worth talking about USAID for a few minutes in detail. I want to talk about both like what USAID is, the kind of legal issues, and the political issues. It is being covered fairly differently on the left and the right. And on, Democrats and more liberal media, what they're essentially saying is like they're kind of emphasizing the aid and the humanitarian aspect. So it's nominally a development agency. Aid is not a word; it's an acronym, Agency for International Development. And last video I recommended, PBS, BBC News. So I actually went through all those two networks' stories about USAID. A lot of the PBS ones come from Associated Press. And they basically tended to focus on the humanitarian aspect, but it is not accurate to characterize USAID as just purely humanitarian. If you read carefully and what Democrats say, it is clearly a tool of U.S. foreign policy and is not just about humanitarian aid. It also does things that are more about security or like funding, dissidents or freedom fighters, things like that. And so it's a little bit like the CIA, honestly. And I don't think people on the left are quite grappling with that. They're acting like it's just purely, food not bombs or something, but it's more complicated than that. Right? You can see that pretty easily from Democracy Now! So Democracy Now! This month or this past week or two has been like kind of outraged.
Doctors Without Borders has warned the dismantling of USAID, the U.S. humanitarian aid system, quote, will cause an unmitigated humanitarian disaster affecting millions of the world's most vulnerable people, unquote. And for more, we go to Jeremy Konyndyk, president of Refugees International. He previously worked in several senior positions at USAID. He was most recently USAID's lead official for COVID-19 in the Biden administration. Thanks so much for being with us, Jeremy. Respond to what has taken place as late as just in the last few hours when the workers at the headquarters of USAID were told to stay home, the office closed.
So over the weekend, we have seen a concerted campaign of disinformation about what USAID is, about what USAID does. A total mischaracterization really doesn't cover it. It is outright disinformation. You heard it from Elon Musk in the clips that you played earlier. It bears no relation whatsoever to the reality of what USAID's work has been for 60 plus years. USAID does development and relief programs around the world. It has helped to save 25 million lives from HIV. It has responded to famines and earthquakes. That was the work that I did in part while I was there during the Obama years. It has promoted democracy. What we are seeing instead are these attacks against it as a sort of corrupt and illegal organization by people who know nothing about it.
They have a video from 10 years ago where they're saying, is USAID the new CIA? And they say this, or they said this, because there was a fairly well-known scandal. I don't know if that's the right word. It's on Wikipedia. I've seen journalists talk about it, where USAID was funding a Twitter clone for Cuba to try to inspire some type of Cuban, kind of like Arab Spring type uprising.
U.S. secretly created Cuban Twitter to stir unrest. That's the name of an explosive new expose by the Associated Press detailing how the U.S. government created a fake Twitter program to undermine the Cuban government. The communications network was called Zunzuneo, the slang for a Cuban hummingbird's tweet. It was reportedly built with secret shell companies financed through foreign banks. The program used cell phone text messaging to circumvent Cuba's strict internet restrictions. At its peak, it drew in more than 40,000 Cubans. However, its subscribers were completely unaware they were using a U.S. government program and giving American contractors their private data to potentially use for political purposes. Perhaps most shockingly, the Cuban Twitter program was not paid for and run by a spy agency such as the CIA. Instead, it was the brainchild of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, best known for overseeing billions of dollars in U.S. humanitarian aid.
One of the elements that we've learned here is that even after Alan Gross was arrested and Congress began to very forcefully scrutinize these types of surreptitious, certainly clearly covert operations being run out of USAID, USAID did not stop them. They continued and escalated.
This is not just like handing out food to starving babies. This is like, let's undermine. I don't know if I even think that's a bad thing. Like, the Cuban government is not obviously good, but it's not humanitarian aid. It's more of like a CIA covert operation type thing. Just kind of scrolling on YouTube, I wasn't even looking for Palki Sharma, but came across a video by Palki Sharma, who is a news anchor from India who I don't know her very well, but I've been following her off and on for like 2 years at least, I think. And so she has a video from a day or two ago just saying like USAID meddles in other people's political systems. And
Trump's justification is ideological. He says US aid was run by radical left lunatics. But politics aside, there is plenty to dig up here, because US aid has a sketchy side too. They have meddled in other countries, funded radicals, and run covert operations. Washington has always used aid to further its agenda. It was never about charity, it was about politics. I have some examples for you. In Cuba, USAID created a social media platform in 2010. It was called Zunzuneo. Example number 2 is Bolivia. USAID funded opposition groups in this country. The goal was to destabilize its then president, Evo Morales. Now, Morales was a socialist leader. His policies were seen as anti-American, so USAID quietly undermined him. In 2013, Morales had had enough. He expelled USAID from the country. Example number 3 is Peru. In the 1990s, the country ran a sterilization program. Around 200,000 women were forcibly sterilized, again with funding from USAID. And these are just just 3 prominent examples. You can keep your interests in mind, but you cannot undermine others.
And then I come across an economist at CEPR, like a left of center economic policy think tank, Jake Johnston. And he has actually a fairly nuanced take. He posted an article 3-4 days ago, kind of describing the impact of USAID in Haiti, which he's an expert on. And like, if you just look at his blue sky, he's pretty negative. He's like not shedding any tears for these Beltway bandit type contractors who are having their funds frozen. The longer article he writes is a bit more nuanced, talking about the negative impact of what's happening. It's like these programs are being cut off immediately without any process for shutting them down. And so it is pretty negative how they're doing this, like the kind of suddenness of it. There's probably a lot of bad programs. They probably could have done this line by line over a period of weeks, and it would have been very popular, and they would have not left people in such of a lurch. I mean, Jake Johnston also talks about how there's a lot of serious problems with the impact USAID has on the local community in Haiti, historically undercutting local producers and farmers and things like that, not really contracting to local agencies.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Where did the money go, and what exactly do you think, is not working, when it comes to USAID?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I mean, I think it failed for Haiti, right? I don't think it necessarily failed for the people who are spending the money. It's the system we build, right? I mean, this isn't like an accident that the money doesn't go to Haitian groups or doesn't go to the Haitian government. It goes to private contractors in D.C., right, on K Street, whatever. That's not an accident. It's because that's the system we've built. Lawmakers pass rules that make it literally illegal for USAID to give money to Haitian organizations in many cases, or make the barriers so high that it's practically impossible. Members of Congress are looking to support U.S. businesses. They're looking to pitch foreign aid as a way to promote the U.S. and not to do development work in Haiti. And so from that perspective, right, I heard this a lot going to Haiti and talking to people involved in these projects, is, our job is to spend the money. It doesn't really matter what we accomplish with it. Like, if we've spent the money, we've done our job, and then we get to move on, right? And so, this obviously has had huge impacts, right? I mean, the Haitian state public services have largely been outsourced, and this is something that's started well before the earthquake. I mean, at the time of the earthquake, 2010, it was between 60, 70% of all public services, education, health, things like this, were all in the hands of NGOs, private actors, multilateral banks, right, outside of the Haitian government. And that has huge impacts. I mean, it totally disconnects the people from their government, because it's not their government that's actually providing these services. It's a foreign actor who's not accountable to you, but is accountable to their donors, who are probably here, right? And, the other sort of dynamic that happened along with this is, like, it wasn't just the Haitian state that was being outsourced. It was our aid system itself, right? So it's not USAID that gets money and then implements projects, right? They get money, and then they give money to another company or another organization that then implements the project, and they take 20% off the top here, right? And it's totally circular. And so what I would say is, like, even if you had the best intentions, if you wanted to do something right, you really couldn't if you were involved in the system. And, one example, there was a handful of companies that got the lion's share of money after the earthquake. Beltway bandits, whatever you want to call them. And there's just a handful all here right in D.C. And after the earthquake, the U.S. government rolled out a reform plan. They wanted to break up these big contracts. They wanted more money going to local organizations. There's really ambitious reforms, and it sounded great, right? The development companies that had just gotten hundreds of millions of dollars for their work in Haiti took that money, hired a well-connected Democratic lobbyist, formed a lobbying group, and fought against those exact reforms that USAID, which was funding them, was trying to implement, right? And so it's just this circular thing where, of course, you're not going to succeed if that's what the rules of the game are.
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention Mike Benz. And if you're right of center, you probably know who Mike Benz is, and if you're left of center, you probably have no idea who that is. So I don't even fully know that much about him because he doesn't have a Wikipedia page. He's a former State Department official in the Trump administration that kind of sees himself as a whistleblower about what he sees as censorship operations happening within the government, USAID, maybe the State Department, funding smear campaigns or censorship type campaigns against Americans and American companies. And I'm not sure what to make of him. There was a NBC article about a year and a half ago saying that he had this kind of alt-right anonymous account years ago. I'm not sure what to make of all that. I'm just mentioning it as context. But this guy, Mike Benz, has been on all of the right of center podcasts and actually just kind of independent podcasts in general. Like he was on Glenn Greenwald's this past week. And his main focus is not USAID in particular. It's more about this kind of concern about censorship and the deployment of State Department or USAID or CIA type resources against Americans. I found him interesting. I found him like kind of credible. Like I felt like a lot of what he's saying adds up, but I don't know how to verify it. I haven't been totally sure what to make of him, but this past week, a journalist who I do consider credible, Li Fang, posted that USAID has been funding, operations against Americans.
USAID, it's like $43 billion a year. A big chunk of that goes to humanitarian purposes, but then the largest portion goes to governance. In the governance bucket, it's actually running and financing and managing media outlets in targeted countries all over the world. A lot of what the government can't do, which is directly censor and shape public discourse, and probably doesn't want to do directly because then it'll blow up in their faces, but it can do indirectly by financing an NGO that finances another NGO that then goes to Facebook or TikTok and says, oh, this is misinformation, remove it. The
Right.
government can't do it directly, so they work through a third party.
So most of the right of center kind of blogosphere, podcasting world, they're all like, Mike, you've been vindicated, and I think there may be a grain of truth to that. So I may play a couple Mike Benz clips just to give you a sense for some of the things he says.
This notion of open society is what allows our U.S. national interests to penetrate the region and influence the internal politics. And I'm not even saying, there's different schools of thought on that. I'm not weighing in on whether that's good or bad. I want free speech on the internet. And I want Americans to be able to determine our own elections and our own social and cultural and political discourse. And I don't want to be caught in a proxy war any longer between this foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks and our domestic speech at home. But what I'm getting at here is, I think what needs to be offered to people who mean well on both sides of the political aisle. I'm not just talking about Republicans, although they happen to be predominantly the ones who have taken this issue up, is you have to be able to articulate a firewall between the capacity to do this in other countries and its blowback on American citizens here and American platforms that are used internationally. Because I don't think you can get the political will to do heavy surgery to this, at least in the beginning, because we have this Moody's, S&P, Goldman Sachs problem, where the people who are tasked with accountability and oversight are all in good standing with these institutions. They don't want to embarrass their friends. They don't want to cause a diplomatic incident that prevents us from, overthrowing a dictator in Belarus or stopping infringements on women's rights in Iran or Afghanistan. I'm not trying to have the elephant trample, the whole wheat field here.
Yeah.
But this specific network has to be stopped. This specific aspect, isn't propaganda enough?
So I really don't understand why there's a lot of people left of center online defending USAID it essentially seems like an iron fist full of M&Ms, and also maybe more focused on cycling money within the DC ecosystem than directly helping people. So, as I said earlier, there's a lot of like legal and process concerns around how this is happening. I was kind of low-key arguing with someone on Facebook, and I was like, I'm not sure this is a good organization, but this should be done lawfully. There's a way to disband an agency set up by Congress, and you do that via Congress. I feel like people should be focused more on that and not so focused on the alleged virtue of the organization.